Without further ado, let me introduce our first panelist. Each of them, they're going to present just a short intro, and then we'll jump right into the questions. Monika, would you like to take it away? Monika, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Monika Jaroszonek, and I'm the CEO at Ratio.City. So we're an early stage Canadian prop tech company. We're based out of Toronto. We started here a few years ago, and we're really excited to have expanded to Vancouver recently. So Ratio.City is a web-based platform for managing and visualizing urban data. We're specifically focused on the built environment, and we're looking at data about all of those physical systems that make up our cities. So it's a web-based platform, and we provide tools and data for city builders of all kinds. We're focused on the real estate developer space. We've also got customers that are architects, urban planners, and municipalities themselves. And we help our users then visualize geospatial data without the need for really complex GIS software. And then we let them derive specific insights and run 3D analysis in real time through a web-based platform as an alternative to some more traditional BIM-based software. So essentially what that means is you can see all sorts of data layers in one easy-to-use place through a web browser, and then you can instantly drop in three-dimensional buildings and determine your land valuation and determine built form analysis instantly. I think that sort of covers a quick overview of our tools, and I'm really excited to hear more from the rest of the panelists today.
Thank you. That was great. We're going to get into more about what you do as part of the questions naturally. Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Harbr?
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm Dave Kim. I'm a co-founder and CEO of Harbr. So Harbr is a platform for construction owners. So we work with owners reps, self-perform, GCs, and trades. And so our core tech connects site updates back to the construction schedule. And site updates are made via SMS. So anyone can update work from anywhere. You don't need data. You don't need a smartphone. And with real-time site data matched to work on a schedule, we can help solve a very important problems like approvals, payments, and invoice discounting. So Harbr looks at key problems around financing and revenue opportunities in payables. So currently trades have very poor access to good short-term financing. Owners, whether debt or balance sheet, have very low yield option on 30-day payable spreads. And of course, owners are losing huge opportunities in top-line revenue generation because of archaic approvals processes. So the best part of Harbr is that you don't need to change your internal process. You keep the same accountability in place, but streamlined through technology. The result is opportunity to increase payable spread and generate new revenue through friendly, opt-in liquidity payments. We workshop use cases in the large residential construction sector. And you can see, on average take-up rate and modest discount terms, the increase in EBITDA margin is significant. This new revenue and additional cash flow helps grow your businesses. So that's why Harbr is different. We don't just streamline workflows, we grow your business. So I'm Dave Kim, CEO of Harbr. Please reach me at dave@harbr.com. Thank you. Back to Andrew.
David, thank you. That actually reminded me of one thing that I was going to tell all the presenters. If you could put your name and contact info in the chat section, that way people have an opportunity to reach out to you if they have questions about your company, or maybe they want to demo your software. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to other David Lod, and he's going to tell you about VEERUM.
Good morning, and thrilled to be here today with a great panel. And Andrew, of course, thank you for moderating today. My name is David Lod. I'm the CEO of VEERUM. VEERUM is a software company headquartered in Calgary, Alberta, and our software spans the entire asset lifecycle. So we get involved with our clients through planning, design, and engineering, really through construction. And then what we do is we provide that golden thread to preserve data from construction through handover into operations and maintenance. So based on the business that we're doing, I'll show you this video here in the backdrop while I'm speaking. So VEERUM takes in all of your existing design information and engineering information. So whether that's your 2 or 3D CAD files, we bring that into our web-based site, and then that's what you're intending to build out in the field. Now, the next step is what's actually going on in the field. So what is that reality scan data, whether that's drone flight, whether that's traditional surveying data, whether that may be, a LiDAR photogrammetry scans. We take that into our site as well, and now we're able to show you the difference from what you were intending to build with what actually is out there in the field, so you can see what's there. The second and third pieces that we then put onto there are, as an example, we look to, we bring in then your document management systems, and your document management systems include whether maybe that's SharePoint. So now when you're looking in real video game type mode, you can go to an asset and see and fly right through the walls and see potentially a pump or a compressor, click on that and get all of the relevant data. So it could be warranty information or potentially an owner or operator manual. And then the final piece after you've got, what you intended to build, what's actually out there, and then the existing documents, what's happening in real time. So then we bring in your live IoT-based sensors or, as an example, a SCADA system. So we can link in with OSI Pi. And on that pump now, we can tell you the actual operating horsepower, the temperature, the pressure. So we've created this 3D visualization platform that's completely web-based. You don't need any software or hardware to work on this. And it allows you to really be on site without going to site. We have clients in Canada and Singapore, South Africa, and we're recently growing into the US as well. So we're working with some of the largest companies that are both in the utility, energy, oil and gas, as well as mining industries, as well as starting to get into manufacturing. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, David. Really appreciate that. Mark, why don't you take it away? We'll, last but not least, we'll have your intro and then we'll jump right into the questions.
Sure. Thanks so much, everyone. And I'll just walk you through a very quick introduction of some of the work UrbanLogiq does. So there we go. Oh, sorry. So UrbanLogiq is a data analytics software company predominantly for governments. And the relevance with regard to the construction and building community is a lot of our involvement with the real estate sector is helping governments understand whether or not a particular development should get approval, particularly when it comes to things like traffic impact analysis and economic impact analysis, and help governments understand the benefits of a development and also any mitigating steps needed to help process a particular application. So we started the company back in 2016. We have offices in Vancouver and New York. Most of our business is in the United States and Canada, split pretty evenly right now. And the biggest way to understand what we do is we use artificial intelligence to take government data as well as private sector data and model out how a particular development will impact a community and whether or not it will live within the thresholds that certain bylaws might have. Most of our business is within the transportation space, but we also do some things around economic development and urban planning. So the way to think about it, I used to be a public servant, and governments sit on a treasure trove of data. Unfortunately, the way that governments currently process the data is very manual, and that's what leads to long, approval cycles where sometimes it takes 6 months to just get, a zoning approval or a deferral, a zoning change approved. And the other part of the problem is that, let's say you wanted to build a development, a greenfield development in the city of Guelph. One of the problems is that the different ministries in the provincial government as well as the local government, each of them will have a say as to whether or not this is a good or a bad idea. And it oftentimes takes a long time to get them all in one place. So by putting all their data and all their processes in one cloud-based platform, it oftentimes will automate the process, and a developer can hopefully get a turnaround decision on a go, no go, or at least a sense of whether or not it's even worthwhile doing a feasibility study fairly quickly. So some of the way we tend to work is we study the workflows of public servants and understand what are the steps needed to get an approval for a new construction permit or a land use change. And then we take their oftentimes static data in PDF formats and Excel spreadsheets, and we combine that with emerging data sources. So that could be computer vision from the streetlight cameras, telecom data, as well as connected vehicle data. And I'll stress that all this is privacy compliant, but we do, for example, take data from cell phone locations and connected vehicle GPS signals, and that way, instead of having to do a very costly traffic impact analysis to see whether or not your development will lead to too much traffic, we can actually just get historical traffic patterns and say we can predict that this will not adversely impact traffic patterns if you were to go ahead with this development. So then our software will then model out the impact on housing and labor, supply chains, and business impact, like local restaurant traffic flows, etc. So oftentimes developments where cities are concerned this will lead to too much traffic, we'll actually be able to bring the economic development agency to the table and say, you actually should approve this because it'll actually support your local businesses. And then, as I mentioned, then you can give a traffic impact analysis using the government's own data. So there's not really an argument whether or not they believe your assessment or not. You're using their own data to prove that your development will not adversely affect things. And as I mentioned, everything we do is independently verified as privacy compliant to the strictest standards, as well as a lot of testing around cybersecurity. So everything that governments consume within the platform is already verified to meet the strictest emerging privacy and data protection standards. So that's a quick summary of UrbanLogic, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you all.
Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate that. We're going to have all the panelists come back on, turn your cameras and mic so we can get into the fun part, which is Q&A. As a reminder to everyone playing at home, if you have questions, I'd love to get them. Just put Q&A on the right to your screens. Moderate dyslexia. Okay, to all our past, Monika, I'm still waiting for you to address again. Thank you. A lot of the people in the audience are in the industry. I'm sure they've been pitched by a lot of companies, many of whom at the 10,000 foot level, or I don't know, maybe I should say at the 3,000 meter level, are roughly broadly similar, or may sound similar to what you're doing. And the other startups in the audience are in the same boat where they need to break through the clutter because they're immediately their customers' eyes glaze over. Like I've heard that before, true or not. So let's talk about what you guys do. What I sometimes use is, imagine you're at a trade show and the people walk past your booth and you have 8 seconds to say something to them to get them to stop or turn around and back you. What do you say? Why don't we start, David Harbr? Why don't we start with you? What gets people to? Sorry, David Kim from Harbr. Why don't we start with you and tell me what gets people to come back to your booth? Like, oh, that's different.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really a question of differentiator. And by the way, I probably would change my name to Harbr at some point.
That's for you if you want it.
But at the end of the day, what we're all looking for, especially in this climate, is hard data and hard differentiator on revenue generation. And in the simplest fact, that's what Harbr does. That's how we position. That's what we do. Whatever our software does is great for streamlining. But at the end of the day, I mean, you saw it in my intro there. Harbr adds pure revenue to your business. It's hard to argue with. So if you can get inside payment rails, that's where you got to sit ultimately.
Okay, while we're on the Davids, David Lodge, why don't you talk to me about VEERUM, right? So I'm walking past your desk. I look up. I'm like, oh, it's another one of those guys. They'll run drones over my site, and then they'll process the images, and they'll hook up. How do you get me to be like, no, man, we're different. We do 8 seconds.
Yeah, I think you're walking by, so you see the video of how cool, you know, your environment can look, and you know, that real video game kind of feel and flavor to it. But what makes us different, I say, how would you like this for your facilities and your enterprise? We can be live in 48 hours. So that catches everybody's eye, because they look at that and say, this is going to take months and months of effort, millions of dollars, lots of time. All of our clients have to do a lot more with a lot less. So when you come to them and say, we can change the game for you in 48 hours and give you measurable ROI, that time to value is unmatched. And that's where they say, let's try it. That's our differentiator.
I could totally see where if you said, hey, I can be your entire company up in 48 hours, I would at least come back and say, nah, really? But that's half the battle, just getting them to ask. Since these are, in theory, 8-second hooks, Monika, how about you? How do you hook them on Radio.City before I move on to, like, I don't know, the lunch buffet?
No, I think what David touched on is actually, you know, identifying whether or not they are a great customer for Ratio.City. And so when we're at industry events, I actually flip it around. I don't talk about Ratio.City. I ask them about their development acquisitions process. I ask about how their last entitlement process went. And, you know, once you understand that, yes, they're having a hard time finding their next site, or they lost their last site acquisition because they couldn't move fast enough, or they made some kind of catastrophic mistake that ended up costing them millions of dollars. That's then when we come in and say, hey, we can help you with that research, with that due diligence, and you can have all that information at your fingertips from any device. And that usually is enough to start a conversation. And again, we've got really great conversion rates to do, you know, much more detailed, in-depth demos, and then convert to sales after that.
Awesome. So, Mark, you got the longest to think about it, so I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball.
Sure.
Let's say your booth is right next to Monika's, right? And like I'm looking at both of you, and I'm like, wait, that kind of looks the same. Pretend for the moment that you don't have to worry about offending Monika by telling the person about how bad her startup is relative to yours. I'm kidding. I'm a New Yorker. I tend to have a little bit of an edge here. But how would you differentiate, like right there, side by side at 10,000 foot view, you're both dealing government data. You know, how do you kind of make it clear to them, like, oh, for X, I want, you know, UrbanLogic, and, you know, maybe for Y, I want the Ratio.City.
Sure. Actually, so I think it's actually fairly easy in that I think there'd be our honest answer would be they're complementary technologies. So the pain point that UrbanLogic solves is workflow and data analysis within government. So a lot of times, City of Ottawa is a perfect example. They're looking at approving, you know, a new development, and actually we'd recommend them to get, you know, to look at additional data sources like Radio.City, for example, to harness all those, you know, 3D visualizations of what it could look like. Where we would come in would be when they're trying to decide whether or not this development would breach the traffic thresholds, whether it would negatively impact local business, these sorts of things. And then that's where oftentimes there are emerging data sources such as cell phone data, connected vehicle data. But if you're a public servant, you're a civil engineer, you don't know how to decode Uber's location data. You don't really know how to integrate, you know, a TELUS API. And so what we do is we harness those kind of unconventional data sets and then use artificial intelligence to say, if Monika says this is a 12-story visualization versus an 18-story, that shouldn't, you know, we would never dissuade anyone from doing that. You should do that. What we would say is, based on the 12-story building, this will be your impact on traffic, versus the 18-story, this will be, you know, those alternatives. So we help the governments understand different scenarios and what the impact on the behavior of the population will be.
Cool. Okay. So now I know what you'll do to get me to, you know, stop, not walk past the booth. Let's take it a step further, right? You all been in the business long enough, unless I'm totally wrong, no one has 100% hit rate on client pitches. When a prospective customer says no, and for sake of argument, let's assume they were one that you thought was a really good customer, not like you found out, oh, maybe not a great fit. But when a real potential customer said no to you, what are the typical reasons they say no? And why don't we, just to shake it up a little, why don't we keep going? Top 1, 2, or 3 reasons they said no. I don't know if there's a little bit of a lag here with that question. So let's start with Mark.
Was that for me?
Okay. Oh, sorry, Mark, why don't you take that away?
Sure. The number one reason, at least with us, is a lot of governments are not.
Yeah. So when the customer says no,
right.
What are the typical reasons?
Yeah, so the main reasons when we run into someone saying no, that was a good lead, it almost always has to do with procurement rules, because we sell to government, so they're not comfortable or not familiar with cloud, or for example, that there is not a procurement vehicle where oftentimes governments will have budgets, but they're not allowed to spend it on, they're not allowed to move it from transportation to economic development, for example. So I think when selling to governments or working with governments, that's oftentimes the biggest challenge is when they have strict procurement rules and there are emerging data sources, things like cloud or artificial intelligence, and they don't have rules around whether or not they're allowed to buy a platform that doesn't have a human in the loop. Those are oftentimes the challenges that we face.
Yeah, and I think
Got it.
for
Let's
us,
keep going in reverse order.
Yeah, for us, again, when we're selling to the private sector, we get responses like, "Hey, we don't have it. We don't have a line item in our annual budget for Ratio.City because, frankly, we didn't exist a year or two ago, and so come back to us next quarter, whatever." Our customers are really used to paying for this information, this data, in a very traditional way. So they're used to paying for it on a project-by-project basis via professional consulting contracts. And so what we're changing, though, is asking them to move away from a project-by-project model to a operating expense. And so sometimes it takes our customers a little bit of time to get their heads around that hey, instead of paying $10,000 for a single study, hey, I can pay $15,000 for a whole year and be able to run this analysis myself. And so we also find that customers that have said no to us in the past, it's a not now. Once they get their head around it and once they realize the value, we've had customers come back to us 6 or 10 or 12 months later and say, hey, we're ready for it now. This makes sense. So that's what we see a lot of.
Yeah, and we, my perspective is sales starts when you hear no, right? Otherwise they're just handing you purchase orders. So you got to work around those objections. But the ones that we get are specifically tied to what Monika mentioned. It's timing, right? It's, we've proven out technology works, the economics and the ROI are there. It's just a fundamental of changing the way people are working with new technologies. And that sometimes gets viewed as maybe a threat to, the way they're doing things today, or maybe somebody had selected a different technology from a long time ago that they're, kind of holding on to. So it's just a matter of timing, right, in education. So sales starts when you hear no, but, we've been fortunate that just the ROI and the benefits of our platform have really helped us knock a lot of that over.
And, I want to Monika's point earlier, you shouldn't be selling anything, right? It's all about discovery at this point, discovering what the problems are. And, if your product can create an elegant solution out of the box, then, excellent. But a lot of the times, workflows are unique. Every company is unique. Sometimes it's a little bit too early. And then this gets to, David's point is that, for a startup, what you want to do is you want to get to a no right away. That's the first step. You have to understand what the challenges are and what the priorities are. And so for Harbr, our first question is, whether or not the person that we're speaking with, the organization that we're speaking with, our construction costs are a big part of their business. And if they're simply not enough of the business to create large returns on, then we know it's too early, right?
Okay, very good. So in part, you're qualifying them a little better up front, and that helps you later down the road when you're closing the sale. Let's shift gears just a little bit. I want to stick with customers, but I want to talk a little bit about cities as opposed to private sectors. I personally am pretty wary about investing in GovTech companies just because I know that sales cycle is different. It's longer, more painful in some ways. And many times, as exactly who asked this question, as Helen in the audience said, local government's budgets are pretty stretched thin. So in some ways, if you think it's hard selling to a developer, try selling to a councilman. So, Mark, you want to talk a little bit about how the sales cycles are different and what, if anything, you've learned that you can do to hack that a bit?
Sure. I think the smartest thing we did was, if you look at our sales team, a lot of our sales team is led by a former public servant, and it's largely former public servants. So we took a bit of a gamble. We didn't hire software salespeople. We hired former public servants who kind of were frustrated with what they had when they worked in those jobs. So I think they're intuitively articulate about the pain points that they face, and they also have an intimate understanding of what exactly is procurement workflows. So one of the things with governments is that even though it's hard to get in, if you understand the structure and you know how to play within the rules, it actually can become something that you can fairly predictably understand, predict, and perform under. And I think one of the things to understand is, if you know how to read procurement cycles and procurement plans, then you can actually tailor. One of the better things about government is that if you know how to look. If you know to research within their procurement and budget plans, you actually know exactly how to define your pitch, so that you can scope your proposal exactly for what they've already decided to buy. And our head of sales, that's the thing she's very talented at. And so I think that's one of the things that with government is that it is a longer sales cycle, but it can be a little bit more transparent and a little bit more well-defined. And so it allows you to scope things with a lot less guesswork.
No, and I think that's interesting. I mean, we've got much less experience selling to government than Mark does, so it's really interesting to hear his perspective. We had figured out a very linear sales process selling to the private sector. When we started talking to government, we did it half-assed backwards, frankly. But what was interesting for us to learn was we were able to go in and talk to the end users, and we understood, based on our professional experience and our tool set, our tools and the value proposition really resonated with those folks. And so we just slowly made our way up the food chain until we got to a point where people, the different departments that would find our tools valuable were asking for it. Then we were able to work with them, to understand their procurement process, and they were able to sort of help us navigate that. But the fact that we had a very specific value that we brought with our tools now let us go back and increase the scope of that initial pilot. For us, I think it would have been much more difficult to go in with a general solution, and then work it back. But because we had a very specific pain point, we could then go in and then expand, which again, for us was really interesting. And we're trying to see if we can replicate that now. Awesome.
Hey, just a reminder, everyone in the audience, if you do have questions, you can put them in the Q&A area. Thank you, Helen. I hope we answered your question. While we're talking about governments, I promise you we'll be back to the private sector soon. As we're talking a little bit about public sector data, I mean, if you think that the developer has messed up data, you should see government data. I have a company in our portfolio, and they were working with the city of Chicago. They said the name Chicago was misspelled over 20 times in their data. So if they can't even get their city name right, I can only imagine about some of the other data. Monika, why don't you keep going and talk a little bit about the challenges of getting access to the government data. I don't know if it's always open access or if you have to get cooperation, how hard it is to onboard those cities if you need their cooperation, pull the data in, clean it up, and to what extent is that a manual process, to what extent is it automated? Share your pain.
Yeah. There's lots of pain out there. No, and that's one of the reasons that this space is so interesting and exciting, because it's a mess to start with. So we've got to start cleaning it up some way. So when we started the company, we looked at just open data. So literally, City of Toronto's got a great the City of Toronto has an open data portal compared to other cities across North America. It's sort of middle of the road. There are lots of cities in the US that have got way more data available, and there's a lot of cities that have much less data available. But we started with that data. We then started looking at data that's in the public domain, but maybe not just sort of presented on a platter, as it were. And the data that we're looking at, because it's about a lot of the sort of regulatory framework and again, some of these systems, that it's not high, it doesn't change with a high frequency. So right now, we take that data, we present it, we ingest it, but we have started creating some automatic tools for data that does change with a higher frequency. So whether it's building permits or development applications, again, we've built some automatic systems that then update that data on a on a manual basis. So right now we're looking at data in the public domain, but we're really interested to start bringing in other data. So some of our customers in the private sector are hosting their data privately on our platform as well. And so we can then allow them to combine data sets and do complex queries. And we're also talking to other, governments about, bringing data on directly. But again, it's a long process. So it's interesting, but I think that's the direction that it will go. We'll go to. I'm curious about how Mark sees this.
Yeah, so that's actually to your point around the messy government data, Andrew. Like that's actually that's the bulk of the work UrbanLogic does. So a lot of times when governments, City of Honolulu, for example, what was a perfect example, was they have decades worth of data, but it's stored in different servers in different departments, different agencies, even different individual public servants all have their own data files. And this has never, ever been centralized, stored, and shared within a government. And so one of the things that led to the birth of UrbanLogic was there are emerging data sources where telecoms and car manufacturers are trying to sell their data to government, and governments are saying, why would I buy more data when I don't even have access to what I've already bought for the last 20 years? And so that's where they'll oftentimes bring UrbanLogic in and say, can you take all of our data from federal, provincial, local governments, from all the different departments, and create one central data repository so we can see for once and for all everything we've ever collected. And to your point, people have stored and categorized and named these things differently for years with all kinds of error rates. And that's when I talk about using artificial intelligence, some of what we do, yes, does predict traffic and those types of things. But actually the majority of our work is the very non-sexy stuff of taking in 20 billion records and identifying the 700 of them that are misspelled, and tricking what should have been a 10-year process into something that we can get done in a couple of days. And so that's actually, I think, where for us at least, the messy government data is actually our core competence as a company. And then once you unlock that data, then it becomes something that companies like Ratio.City could then use because it's never before been accessible. So that's most of what work that UrbanLogic does, is clean that data.
I'm so sorry to hear that. That sounds as much fun as you just made it sound. But if it were easy, everyone would be doing it. Okay, let's talk about something that's only marginally easier, which is finding new sales prospects, right? So from the perspective of the designers, developers, architects in the audience, like you just kind of magically show up in their inbox or on their phone or at conferences, but it's actually tricky to find good prospects, to know like this guy is a high likelihood I should go call, this company first versus that company. So David, let's start with David Laud. When you put together a prospect list, how do you figure out what your universe of potential customers are to talk to? How do you figure out which ones you want to focus on? Like I got 100 guys on my list. I'm going to start with, her and then him. And then, how do you actually get through to the right decision maker? We could spend about 3 hours on that, but let's try to spend a few minutes.
Yeah, no, we certainly could. I think if you look at it just, if we're talking about startups as organizations here, you got to look at this in 2 stages of time. So at the beginning, if you're just getting going and you're really trying to determine your product market fit, I would not spend your time wasting trying to go after 10, 20, 30 particular clients. Find 1 or 2 that are very interested in learning more, that work with you, that want to help you develop that solution so that you've got a real industry specific pitch that you've really hardened, and your product, you can take that out to new clients. The worst thing you can do is go have 20 false starts with interested prospects and try to go back in again. So once you've kind of solidified that pitch, and it will evolve over time, then you go back out. So you really want to identify the persona. So maybe it's a vice president of operations, or maybe it's somebody, as an example, that handles turnarounds in large industrial environments, and that's critical path items. They own the risk, they own the budget. When you define that persona, you can bring in that specific pitch, and that's how you go after it. There's tons of tools, whether it's LinkedIn, you can hire lead generation firms, but really you're going to be your best salesperson for those initial years as you're getting going. And when you start to get that scale, when you start to realize that clients really need what we have, it becomes a lot less difficult. The market starts to self-educate on the importance of these solutions, and then the really fun starts to happen. But yeah, it's a heavy lift in the early days, and more is not necessarily better. When we got going, we really kind of picked a few key clients, and you know, they've grown 10x with us in a short period, just by having our arms around them, learning from them, and then starting to extrapolate that to new prospects.
So that's actually a great point. And in your business in particular, it sounds like you'll service both industrial and real estate. So I can imagine that early on, you know, there was a bit of a discussion: where am I getting the most traction? Who's leaning into my solution the most? Let's double and triple down on that, rather than try to pursue 2, 3, or more verticals at once. I know our portfolio companies go through that same discovery process. Dave, Kim, this time, how about you? Similar insights. Like, how do you decide where you're going to focus your sales efforts, and how do you find the right person there to connect with?
Yeah, so you know, as founders of startups, our job is to sell, and our job is, you know, to the earlier point, is to get to the no. You know, as founders, we've got to figure it out. We've got to figure out why it's a no and why it's a yes. For us when we look at you know, prospecting or finding customers to work with or partners to work with, we generally look at their construction volume. And if we're really lucky and they're public, we can see their last 12 months EBITDA. And then that way we can make a really compelling case on revenues versus on construction costs, and then, you know, margin lift on EBITDA. But generally where we see inbound is, you know, from our content. We have a fairly strict content you know, generation kind of cycle that goes on. We like to engage a lot. And because we work very, very closely with our customers today around, you know, every aspect of our business and our products and how we help them, a lot of it's generated through word of mouth today. Now, who we generally target is it's generally the CFO, right? We're looking at the CFO strategy on 30-day payables. So we generally speak with them. We show them you know, the outcomes on the revenue, and then it's a discussion with the construction director to figure out, okay, how do we then, what are the problems around lifting this data from the field, and then using our SMS technology to actually bridge that gap, you know, get inside of every pocket, because we're notionally already there on SMS. So then when those two bridges are linked together, that's generally when we have really, really good discovery and use case. But content is probably the best thing. Obviously, word of mouth is the best because the amount of trust and that comes with it. But yeah, our strategies are mainly word of mouth and content.
Yeah, and I think being very targeted, and again, you know, using industry knowledge, you know, to be able to find the customers that, again, the companies that we know would be great customers. And so because we're looking at developers, you know, people who are active in acquisitions, who, you know, have maybe just finished a few projects that, you know, are going to be looking for their next projects, that, you know, and what we find really resonates is when we get the end users. And so maybe it's the analyst or maybe it's the VP of acquisitions really excited about the opportunity with the tool. And when it aligns with the corporate strategy, you know, the C-suite level, you know, objectives that, hey, they want to, you know, make sure that they've got enough projects in their pipeline, that becomes a very easy sell for us. So we've just gotten very good now at, you know, outbound. We do a lot of research, and then we do really targeted outbound, and that converts really nicely for us.
Mark, up to you.
Sure. So I think a little bit building what Monika said. So one of the things that our head of sales recently did is, so she analyzed, this is again a benefit of the public sector, is they publish contracts. So she analyzed 2,612 published contracts of where people bought things that are in our space, and then we analyze what they all had in common. And for example, whenever people bought analytics, they were almost always preceded like a year before, where they bought a massive amount of data. So a lot of times they'll buy a lot of data, and then the following year they hired someone to fix it. So we identified like things like that, which were so we set up systems where it started identifying any government that, you know, had, you know, one of 11 different characteristics that we've seen consistently leads to them wanting to buy a service like ours within the next year. And then just given the government sales cycle, which could be 9 months, we then started I think a big thing with us is we don't see them as governments, but they're people. They're people within these agencies, and we identified who are the decision makers, and we went out to conferences in their region. We joined associations where we knew these people were members of, and over the year preceding where we wanted to go after sale with them, we built those relationships. So by the time we eventually bid with them, this is particularly important as a startup. It wasn't like we've competed, for example, for us versus Google or IBM. And that would normally be considered a high risk thing to go with a startup, except, well, we've gotten to know you and your team over the last year. You're solid people. We like your work. So, you know, it's kind of on a personal level, a de-risk thing. And I think David was mentioning the thing around content. One of the things we also identified was by joining these associations, attending conferences, we identified the very obscure things they're interested in. And for example, we recently published an ebook on different ways of analyzing mobility flows and different metrics along those lines. So we knew these are the things that they're curious about, and we published books on that. And then anyone who downloads that very obscure book, you're gonna be a person that's very interested in our space. So it's things like that, getting to know exactly who your customers are, the persona, as David was talking about, and then honestly crafting yourself to be exactly who they're looking for.
So that may be the last time I download an ebook. But kidding aside, for the startups out there who are listening, one of the things I think you really need to take away from this is that you are not targeting general contractors. You're targeting a specific person within a specific type. It may not be the largest, probably not the smallest, but you're really starting with a very tight definition of who you want to talk to, and then working to get to them. And I hope for everyone else in the audience, next time you get a call from startups or an email from startups, you realize a lot of thought has gone into why they're reaching out to you. Or maybe they're just starting and none at all has. If you're like, well, I'm totally the wrong person for them to talk to. But please take 5 minutes to explain to them who within the organization is. That's a great way to give back. Let's switch gears now to something that's probably one of the hardest things for startups to figure out, and maybe one of the more mystifying things for the customers to understand. How do you decide what to charge for your startup? And that goes both like the overall model, transactional, SaaS, recurring subscription, or something completely different. Not only the right way to do it, but also what the right amount is. And I think, since Monika, you touched on it previously, why don't you expand on what you said earlier, and then we'll work our way through the panel.
Yeah, no, and I'm going to start my answer. How we got to our pricing. My background is architecture. I never planned on running a tech company, but I used to do this analysis all the time, the old-fashioned way. And so I know that, again, as a professional, my time was worth a certain amount of, my professional experience, the amount of time to gather this data. I knew what those numbers were, and I used to sell to this industry my professional services. And so our ROI is very much based on, I know that if you want to get these answers, you would typically reach out to, your architect, your urban planner. You would need to wait for them to do the research and then get back to you, and then they would charge you a certain amount. And so, our pricing was sort of based on the value that we know that providing these answers quickly will bring. Time savings, productivity. If you've got an internal team, how much are you paying your analyst? How long is it taking them to gather this data? So that becomes a fairly straightforward calculation that we can present. And again, because we know our customers, we know this is how they think about things. And so when we can present our pricing and say, hey, you know what, this is, as soon as you do 3 of these reports, we've paid, you've paid it off, and you've still got the rest of the year, to benefit from that. And that really resonates. The other thing is looking at other things that they're used to buying. So, other products, other services that they currently subscribe to. Again, we're in line. We're not going to be, 7 times more expensive than the other stuff that they're paying for, but we're also not going to come in, way, way cheaper, because again, we know that we're providing significant value and we're complementary to some of the other services that they're paying for similarly.
Yeah, and we've, pricing is an interesting one. So it absolutely needs to be founded on, an ROI or something that's measurable and comparable, right? So when we look at, are we replacing any existing systems, or maybe a degree of some certain licensing for other systems? You know, you can quantify that. Is this changing the way people work? So an example for ours, we realized we're saving, you know, one company thousands of hours of windshield time driving from, you know, head office or an airport actually out to these remote sites. You know, what is that worth, right? And then where's the safety component? And this is really talking about transitioning to a new way to do business, and you know, what are the gains you're going to get out of that will really help, you know, articulate your pricing. So, you know, sadly, or, you know, thankfully, every client that we still engage with wants to do a pilot, right? They're like, we'd like to pilot this. And when you live in startups, you can die in pilot hell. Like, you've got to be incredibly disciplined in a pilot process to make them successful. So that means, one, getting a paid engagement, two, identifying the milestones that you will hit that will trigger that ongoing contract in order for you to make that investment. And really getting the client to put some skin in the game here, right? If you really believe that your product or your solution technology is game changing, it drives those ROIs, go through that process with the client, have them learn and understand it. They'll actually come up with more use cases than you will come up with, because they're the users, right? They're the industry experts. So when it comes to pricing, you know, the large publicly traded guys, they go through a procurement process, or maybe you get bolted onto a, you know, a capital project budget. If you're going for government and crown corporations, there is an absolute, you know, you have to go through RFP, they have to award, it takes a long time. And if you get through that, congrats. Our early days, we actually targeted a few small and mid-market companies where we knew, you know, the COO could just sign something off on a piece of paper and not really go through a formalized procurement partner. That's good too, but it's all different. And what I would just kind of leave you with is, do not get in a price slashing game early with clients in order to get to a contract. You'll commoditize yourself so fast and you'll never get back up the other way, right? If you know what it's valued at, you know, stick to your guns. It's okay to walk away from some clients.
Yeah, so, you know, I'll just jump in here for a second. You know, early on, so this is my second startup. My first startup
Mark,
was called Go Instant. Sorry, I might just keep going. So, you know, we
Sorry,
looked
Dave,
at,
keep going.
you know,
It's cool.
something with, you know, David touched on, Monika touched on, is around understanding what the competitive landscape is doing. So what we did, we looked at that. We looked at the same approach, but instead we went and spoke to our customers or prospects and said, what don't you like about this sort of pricing? And for most of the time, it's kind of like, well, we don't want to do a percentage of our construction costs and have that be the SaaS fee. It just, you know, it doesn't really help us work with your software in this mutual beneficial way. So for us, you know, understanding what our prospects' challenges were around pricing, but you know, I'm going to say that, you know, Harbr isn't free. We charge a notional fee for our software, but most of our revenue comes from interest that's generated from the bank and profit sharing on the payment discounts. So really, the way that our business makes money is if our clients make money, and we're only sharing a small percentage of whatever revenues that they're generating based off of our software and our workflows. So we find that you know, pricing that's directly tied to an investment, or through, you know, profit sharing or contingency, saving contingency, you know, it makes a lot of sense for a lot of clients because they're already doing like IPD models or P3 models where they're kind of living in this world around profit share and trying to maximize revenue generation. So that's how we thought about it.
Yeah, and so I think there was two stages, I guess, at UrbanLogiq, and this is the ugly truth, I think, of a lot of startups that we maybe try not to hide, that we try to hide from people. But when we started out, honestly, it's not sustainable, but our goal was to get any deal at any cost, just to prove whether or not we need to know whether or not this is actually a need and whether or not we can solve it. And so it's always a bit of a gamble. And so the way we oftentimes did it was we would go to governments and either find through publicly available sources or just ask them, what is your procurement threshold? As in, like, what can you as a department head buy without having to take this to budget? And miraculously, when they would say it's $33,000, we would price it at $32,800 if we can get a quick yes. But that, to be clear, that's not sustainable. That's to get in the door and prove your value. And then so I think that the advice I'd give to people is, from day one, measure and quantify your value and have hard numbers. So for example, we were able to find out that the typical government that processed 2,147 files of 39 different fields, it'll cost them $112,320 every time they do that. So now we have a hard number. If we can come in under that, what used to take 30 working days with us now takes 560 seconds. So you can actually quantify at $39 an hour what value savings you're providing to the customer. And once you have that, and most importantly, make sure you're not the one that says this. So we published some white papers from the city of San Jose or the city of Ottawa, where they actually wrote the paper on our behalf and said, we found these quantifiable savings. And then when we go to clients, we can say, this is kind of the savings you can expect. We will guarantee it. We will actually contractually be bound that we will provide these savings, or we don't meet our contract thresholds, we don't get paid. And I think that gives the peace of mind to governments that you're making some pretty outlandish claims. We're going to cut 95% of your costs. The other aspect to that, though, is you also have to have a firm grip on your internal costs. So you have to know not just how much it costs to make your product, but how much does it cost to sell. So oftentimes, your customer acquisition cost. So between those two things, how much it takes for you to build it, support each individual client, and sell and provide good customer service for each of those clients, that becomes your floor. And then what we try to do is we try to make sure that the government gets at least a 10x savings when they buy us. So we know what our floor is. We know what savings we want the governments to get, and within that kind of space there is what we price it at. And honestly, if we can't sell something to a government where they're going to get 90% off, then that's a bad client, and we just won't target those clients.
Cool, great, thanks. And I want to apologize to everybody. I'm not sure why my video is lagging or my audio is lagging, but thanks, especially the panelists who've managed to make it look easy. By the way, at least we'll have great edit points when we chop this up for video content. We have time for one more question, and given that it's probably on everybody's mind, let's talk about I don't know, global pandemics. You thought I was going to say the Stanley Cup, didn't you? Anyway, let's talk about the impact that COVID's had on your business. So let's try just very briefly, did it hurt you? Did it not hurt you? Was it kind of neutral? And then more importantly, what did you do in response for it? Like, was there a lemonade out of lemons opportunity? Did you change the product? Did you just change how you presented some of the features of the product? Did you create a whole new product? Did you scrap your entire company and rebuild it from scratch? What did you do in response to COVID? And then it's a multi-part question, so I hope you're writing it down. My question is, do you think that new revenue stream is going to persist and be the thin end of the wedge that introduces customers to other stuff that you do? Or are they just going to use that one, and when, hopefully the pandemic passes, they just stop using that? Because ideally, you'd like that to be the thin end of the wedge to open up a land and expand opportunity. So I apologize, that's a 3 or 4 part question, but why don't we start with whoever I said we were going to start with? Did I say? If I didn't say, why don't we start with Mark?
Sure. For us, because what we do is government analytics, I think we lost a lot of business, frankly, on a lot of the other things that we thought were going to come in 2020. On the flip side, within the day the pandemic hit and the shutdowns happened all around the world, a lot of our existing clients came to us and said, "Are you able to do modeling of how the pandemic will impact our economy, impact our health system?" So one of the things I'm really proud of our team is, in the middle of them dealing with their own personal lives with the shutdown, they started providing pandemic predictions and reports to clients within 48 hours. So I think our team here at UrbanLogic really pulled off some personal miracles, and I owe a lot to them. And because of that, to your point, Andrew, I think a lot of the clients who were kind of, flirting with the idea of UrbanLogic, when they saw the responsiveness of the team, they started buying the rest of our product suites. So I think the pandemic gave us the opportunity to prove what we're capable of. And it's one of these things I want to be careful. A lot of people are suffering. So it's never going to be something we're going to celebrate, but it's something that I think has given UrbanLogic and the team here the opportunity to show what they're capable of. And it's tragedy for many, but from a business point of view, it's been a healthy thing for us.
Yeah. So with Harbr, we saw this pretty early on. So throughout 2018, we were building a portfolio of retail customers in our portfolio. So we had emerging brands and we had established brands that were building, hundreds of stores and kiosks and all these sorts of things. And that's what our platform was really good at, taking all these data points from people's pockets and making all of these hundreds of schedules kind of, more automated around workflow. But then, this happened and a lot of our emerging brands, they stopped building. They all stopped building. Interestingly, though, the established brands, they had already a plan because they were being impacted in other ways throughout 2017 and 2018 that really helped them get through this part. They had already a plan that was going to, kind of get them through this. So we ended up seeing that the emerging brands kind of rolled back a lot very quickly, starting to ramp up again now. But the established brands really, they kept going. They kept doing what they needed to do because they already had that plan in place. So I thought that was super interesting. But throughout that, in terms of what happened to us, we ended up responding very quickly. And this is a part of being a startup. You have to be incredibly nimble around what's happening, and you have to adapt really, really quickly. And especially keeping in contact with your customer so tightly, your nimbleness helps them grow faster. So we ended up moving away from data for performance analytics, keeping all of the coordination, but then going data for financials. And that really turned the switch on. Okay, we're not super interested in insight right now. What we are super interested in is making money or saving money throughout this time. And so this goes into the final kind of like part of this question, which is, are these long-lasting products that we build? Look, if we don't build products that have vision, then we're doing it wrong. And so, making the decision around going from an analytics-based product to a financial-based product, it's not something that we take lightly. It's something that we say, it's creating traction now. It's creating massive momentum now. What kind of vision does this paint around the original vision? And given that the core technology is there, given that the core data model is there, and then it all makes sense. It all comes through to the end. So if it's short-term goals that you're trying to pivot on, you're probably doing it wrong. But at the end of the day, it's what your customer wants.
Yeah, and for our side, I remember March 13th we called it for our company and said we're going completely remote. We need to support each other and our clients and still try to grow. So there's no doubt that there was 6 weeks of absolute uncertainty. And as a CEO, I had to look at and say, okay, where's our cash runway right now as we're trying to scale, and can we extend that? Because we don't know how long this impact's going to actually happen. And then, even more important than your cash runway is that hidden runway. Are you going to burn your people out? And what is their mental health capacity really to continue on this journey as the world's just changed, right? So we kind of got to look at both of these in stride and hope one doesn't run out before the other. And then, we were fortunate, just the fact that we allow people to remotely be on site and, do model reviews and all that. We actually saw a surge of activity, a shrinking of sales cycle and pipeline for us. So it has been beneficial, and it's really become part of clients' business continuity plans now, versus just kind of a nice to have. So we'll keep watching for it. I was proud of how our company made that change.
Mark? Oh.
Monica, why don't you wrap this up and then I'll wrap everything.
All right. No, I mean, I think in terms of the COVID impact that we saw, again, we see commercial real estate as a very slow moving slow-moving ship. So we decided very early on, just double down on understanding what our customers were going through. And again, all of a sudden, this idea of digital, web-based tools went from being a nice to have to, in some cases, the only way to access some of the data that was, either housed in, paper copies on people's desks or on servers at people's desks. And so that, for us, was interesting to see. Our customer user interactions with the platform, as soon as they figured out how to work from home, it was fairly steady all the way through. But we did see that the decision-making process slowed down a little bit. And so we did try to innovate on that and, again, reduce the risk for somebody to make the decision in these sort of uncertain times. And we found that to be quite successful. But I think in general, this bigger trend to working from home, creating an agile workforce really resonated. And so there's a few new things that we're seeing take off now as a result of those conversations that we had earlier in the pandemic. Andrew there?
Excellent, thank you. And we are just about out of time. So let me remind everyone in the audience, all the panelists and I have put our contact info in the public chat. Okay, I think there's a lag. I'm just gonna keep going. All our contact info is in the chat. So if you're learning more about any of the companies that are presented today, send them an email. I give my checkbook as the subject line. Just kidding. You could say can BIM follow-up questions and their company name, and they'll get right on it. I thank everybody, starting with the panelists. You guys have been great. Thank you, Jerry, for organizing and all can BIM. Thank you for the audience for joining us today. We hope the rest of your day is even better. Scott.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.